This is Tao Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to yet another episode of Tao Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host, and I'm so happy and pleased to have as our guest today Professor Tamar Herzig. Thank you so much for being here.
It's nice to be here.
To our listeners and our viewers, I would say that Professor Herzig is from the Department of History. She's with the Tzvi Yavitz School of Historical Studies. She's the Konrad Adenauer Professor of Comparative European History at Tel Aviv University and currently serves as the Vice Dean for Research at the Faculty of Humanities, Vice Chairperson of the Historical Society of Israel, which is a very big deal, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Renaissance Society of America. You'll have to tell us about that. What is the Renaissance Society of America? We'd love to hear about that. And between 2014 and 2021, she served as director of Tel Aviv University's Maurice E. Curiel Institute of European Studies. Wow, what a big title you have. And you wrote a very influential article titled Slavery and Interethnic Sexual Violence, a Multiple Perpetrator Rape in 17th-Century Livorno. Now, this may sound to our viewers and listeners as something not relevant to what's happening today, but we will learn today from you that it is very relevant. Am I correct?
Yes.
So please tell us a little bit about your background. How you started, how you ended up doing this.
As a historian. So I'm a historian of early modern Italy. Early modern is roughly from 1400 to 1800. And I just fell in love with the Italian peninsula and Italian history and culture. But then somehow I became immersed in the what you might call the dark side of the Renaissance, namely the oppression and persecution of marginalized groups, of the prosecution of heretics and religious dissidents, the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, and more recently also the oppression of Jews and the conversion of Jews, and then after that, I actually stumbled upon a case of Jewish slavery, and that turned my attention to the phenomenon of enslaving Jews in Renaissance Italy, and which has not been studied almost at all. I mean, there are hardly any studies that even mention the enslavement of Jews in Renaissance Italy. Livorno, the city that you mentioned, is commonly perceived as one of the places in which Jews enjoyed relative freedom and exceptional privileges in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And what I found during my archival research, I'm a social historian, and my work is based on archival findings. I just found this case of that deals with enslaved Jewish women who were held at the slave prison of Livorno and were subject to very cruel, what we would call group rape, gang rape. And it's a case that has been, as I was able to show in this article, it was first publicized widely as part of the efforts to extract money from the local Jewish community in Livorno that was very rich. It was a community of mostly Sephardic merchants of Spanish origins. And then when...
By the way, it's the community that later on produced luminaries like Modigliani.
It is, yeah. It was the community itself was very affluent and very enjoyed much prestige. The women who arrived there as slave women were not local. There were Jewish women who were captured elsewhere. They were not Italian, and but they were Jewish, and so the local Jews tried to help them, tried to help redeem them. They were regarded as captives. Indeed, they had been captured by Tuscan forces, by the corsairs of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. Corsairs were pirates who were working in service of the state of the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, and generally, I discovered that Jews were regularly captured either on the coasts of North Africa or in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean, on the Greek islands that were then under Ottoman rule. So they were enemy countries. And this was the period, the 16th and 17th centuries are the period of religious conflict between Christianity and Islam. So it was legitimate to enslave anyone who was a subject of the Ottoman Empire, as long as this person was not a Christian. So Jews, even though they were not Muslims, were captured and enslaved. They could be ransomed by the local Jewish community, but for Jews, the sums requested were usually very high. It was a way of extracting money from, in the case of Livorno, a very wealthy community. And in this case, the leaders of the community did not come up with the requested sum soon enough, and so the official in charge of Livorno's slave prison just basically ordered the raping of the enslaved Jewish women, which was an unprecedented thing. And then when the Jews of Livorno, their leaders, complained to the Grand Duke in Florence, what we see is that the same person who had ordered and then publicized the very gruesome details of this horrific gang raping of Jewish women starts a campaign of silencing and denying the fact that it ever happened. So basically, I was able to show in this article both why he did it and how he did it, and how first you publicize something like that, a very brutal sexual crime against a peculiar group of women as part of an ethno-religious conflict, and then you start a denial campaign. And I was able to show this through an analysis, a textual analysis of documents that I found at the archives of Livorno and Florence.
Now, obviously, it's very similar to what we're seeing now with Hamas and the allegations against mass rape during the October 7 atrocities, but I don't want to jump now to that. Let me ask you a question about the way the article was received by your academic colleagues worldwide. And I'm beyond horrified, like many of us, at the response, at the silence, especially in the humanities, in universities in the Western world, post October 7th, and the realization that evil that is done to Jews is considered now in academic circles as a lesser form of evil. Did you encounter that perception when this article came out talking about Jewish slavery?
No. I have to say that when I talk about the past, I did not encounter this kind of silence outside of Italy. I mean, the article was published in the American Historical Review, which is the leading English language journal in historical studies, read by historians of all fields and specializing in all periods of historical of history. And it did. The article won 2 prizes, and it was even reported in Newsweek. It was aroused much interest. In the English-speaking academic community and beyond, also in the general public. It was there was an article in Haaretz in English and an article about it in the Jerusalem Post. What I was hoping, and I also published a sequel article to this one about the man who had orchestrated the rape. And this person is still until today considered one of the founding fathers of Livorno. He's like the Yoel Moshe Salomon of Livorno. Livorno was like Petach Tikva in that it was an area of that had to be. It was a city that was actually established as a new city, and this person, Bernardetto Buonromei, who ordered the rape, was one of the founding fathers of the newly established city, and he is still very much admired in Livorno until this very day. There's a street named after him. There are public reenactments of the elevation of Livorno to the status of a city in 1606, in which his figure is there's an actor that impersonates his role as one of the leading figures in Livorno's history. There's a wine and dine with this person, and I was hoping that this might change once his role in the slave trade was exposed in my article, and especially his involvement in ordering the serial raping of a group of Jews. This did not happen. The article was published in March 2022. It was then discussed in several newspaper articles in Italy, but nothing has changed as far as Livorno is concerned.
I should say that, talking about street naming, because of the prominence of Livorno as a Jewish community, I think there are several streets named in Israel after Livorno. One of them I know for sure is in Bat Yam. But let's talk about the history of abusing women in the context of war. So you studied Europe during Renaissance, but you have a lot of knowledge about that in general, even in modern history, certainly what happened on October 7th. So tell us a little bit, what is it that makes it such an historical phenomenon? It happens time and again.
So there's a very influential book by Susan Brownmiller about rape that actually, as a weapon of war, that actually goes back to ancient history and argues that this was a way of expressing military victory in all kinds of conflicts between different groups from times immemorial. And we do know that women's bodies are often associated and had been associated in traditional societies with communal honor, with the honor of a specific tribe or community or a nation, and therefore the violation of the sexual violation of women was a means of humiliating the opponents, the enemies in battle. There are early stories from the time. There's a myth of the rape of the Sabine women in ancient Rome, in which the ancient Romans basically abducted women of a rival, an enemy tribe, and took them to Rome, and in this way they became kind of like the ruling victors of became the Romans, what we associate with the Romans. However, so this was, and it had, sexual violence had been traditionally regarded as kind of a something that happens in war. It was often perceived as something that is almost inevitable, but this changed after the Second World War, and as the accounts of what the Soviet army did at the aftermath of the war, and the UN actually defined the sexual violence against women and rape as a crime against humanity later on, after what happened in Bosnia in the 1990s. We also know from more recent research by social scientists that it is not inevitable, that it does not always happen as a kind of systematic or preconceived intentional strategy of war. So we should distinguish between opportunistic rapes, a specific soldier or a militant who just takes advantage of the war situation, of the fact that he's armed to obtain sexual gratification through rape.
Let me ask
These things are, have happen occasionally. But what I noticed in the Livorno context, and what we also saw on October 7th, is something that is planned and that is part of a strategy aimed at inflicting psychological terror, at humiliating the rival, the camp, or the humiliating the enemies collectively, and by abusing the bodies of women. So the women are the victims, but the aim is much broader, and this is something that is not inevitable. It doesn't always happen, and we know, for instance, that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it was not a regular part of the conflict. I mean, many things happened on both sides, but sexual violence was not normally part of the conflict. I mean, killing was, and other things were, but not. And this has been studied again by social historians as an exceptional case. There was even one anthropologist who devoted a study to the fact that Israeli soldiers do not rape Palestinian women, even though they are the armed part in this conflict. I should say, however, that I'm not implying that Israeli soldiers never inflicted any kind of sexual violence against Palestinian women. We know that these things happened. There was an infamous case in 49, Parashat Re'im, of a group raping of a Bedouin girl by soldiers. But in these cases, they were perceived as an aberration that should be prosecuted and punished.
Yeah. Now, so what you're telling us is basically that, based on the information that we have so far about what happened on October 7th, is that this was not an opportunistic mass rape, but it was actually part of the plan. Would you say it's similar to what ISIS did to the Yazidi women?
Similar, yes. So it's not. There's a book by Christina Lemb, who also wrote about the October 7th massacre, about what war does to women, and she actually refers to what ISIS did to the Yazidi women. There are certainly similarities in that women are sexually abused as a way of humiliating and defeating, also psychologically, the other the enemies. And this is something that is common in traditional societies in which women's presumed honor is tied to the communal, collective honor of the group.
Now, you mentioned in your article the efforts to silence the women in Livorno. But here we're experiencing something very different than you, and you brought graciously a pamphlet from a rally at Stanford University, which our listeners cannot see, but our viewers can see. And here we are bothered with a different kind of silence. We're bothered by the silence of organizations and institutions that are meant to protect women and are meant to prevent gender-based violence, and yet they're silent about what happened to women. By the way, not only Jewish women.
Yes.
There were many kinds of women that were abused and violated and raped on October 7th. How do you explain that silence?
I have to say that I continue to be shocked by it, because to my mind, it goes against the most important achievements of the feminist movement of the last decade, basically the Metoo movement, of having to believe the victims. And what we see here is a denial campaign despite the fact that the perpetrators, the rapists themselves, filmed themselves and photographed themselves and sent and posted online the evidence of their sexual crimes, of their mutilating of the bodies of their female victims, also men and children. We know that. So we know that. But there's a very active denial campaign. And it has, so one strand is to deny that, there were no rapes. There is no way to counter this kind of fake news thing, because these things were immediately on October 7th. There were already images that are not, cannot really be mistaken for anything else. But there are efforts to deny it. Another strand is focusing on what the so-called context, so maybe, there was sexual violence, but this is all the result of Israel's ongoing maltreatment of Palestinians, and should be seen within the context of the conflict, of the ongoing conflict, and is just one more example of this. So with the second kind of arguments, I think it is important to remember that as these very organizations that you mentioned have been arguing for decades, and especially in the last few years, nothing can justify rape. There is the context does not matter, just as it does not matter what a woman wore, or if she walked alone at night, or if she was drunk, or if she was at a party, or if she, flirted with the man. He should still not be allowed to sexually assault a woman under any circumstances. So this is the traditional feminist argument about sexual violence against women. And here, suddenly we see these very same organizations saying, no, but the context, as if Israeli women and girls, also boys, deserve to be raped just because of the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is something that has to be called out repeatedly, I think, just that no one who defines herself or himself as a feminist can say, maybe there was sexual violence, but it's part of the conflict. Nothing justifies the abuse of women's bodies.
Yeah, and yet they do justify it. And I'd like to share with our listeners and our viewers a quote from the event, your quote from the event at Stanford, and I'll paraphrase, I don't want to do the whole thing, but you say, what is astonishing is the willingness of feminist activists and organizations to abandon what came to be regarded as the sacrosanct motto of the Metoo era, I believe you. They don't believe us, our women, only because they're associated with Israel, either Israeli citizens or foreign workers that happen to be there. And the question is, what can we do? I came from a month-long speaking tour in North America recently, and I'm about to embark on another speaking tour in 2 weeks. And I experienced the frustration of people firsthand. What can be done?
Well, I think it is very important to remind the audience. I don't know what what specific audiences you will be addressing, but to remind them of the fact that, again, nothing can justify the rape of any woman in any circumstances, because if we allow rape in certain circumstances, this is a slippery slope. I mean, then someone can say, well, I raped her, but I thought she wanted it. Anything can be said once you once you say that the context does matter as far as rape is concerned. No, it does not. Some crimes against humanity and rape of women during a conflict, an armed conflict, is now defined by the UN as a crime against humanity. So this is something that should be mentioned. We should repeatedly bring up the identity of so many of the victims. The fact that there were students, that there were young girls at a party, people who were not themselves involved in any kind of violent action themselves. And I also think it's important to stress the fact that this is a watershed in relations between Israel and its neighbors, because something like that has never happened before. I mean, there was violence, there were pogroms earlier on, there were terrorist attacks, and of course, Israel is inflicting violence on Gaza right now as we speak. Normally, it is somewhat more customary to focus on the dead bodies that are not gendered, and these are the casualties that we see or that we think of when we think about the conflict. And this is another way of silencing sexual violence. You don't count the raped victims, the people whose lives had been shattered, whereas we know from studies that sexual violence, rape during war, has been defined as slow murder, because the victims who were not immediately murdered, as was the case, we know, was often the case on October 7th, those who were not murdered are indeed suffering kind of a slow murder as survivors. Also, anyone who witnessed this kind of horrible, horrific sexual violence, the people who testified about it later on, the rescue forces who saw the mutilated bodies and the signs of sexual violence, the broken bones, they will be suffering and are already suffering from a secondary trauma. And this is something that should also be taken into consideration when we think about the casualties of a conflict.
Now, let me ask you a question. There's a debate about the images of the atrocities, and I'm specifically referring to images that prove the point that some people, unfortunately and sadly, are trying to deny, that there was gender-based violence towards women on the Israeli side on October 7th. And do you think it's the right thing to do to share those images with the world, considering that some of them are, so those who survived will have to deal with that trauma? As you said, it's a slow death because they will have to carry this for the rest of their lives. And so you have to balance the privacy issues and the well-being of the survivors and the well-being of the families of the victims that did not survive, and the need of the system to make the case. We need to build the case. It could be a legal case, it could be a moral case, it could be an ethical case, it can be a cultural case, but we need to make the case. How do you balance between the two?
I think it is very important to show the images, not in the internal Israeli discussion. I think we're all traumatized enough. We don't need to be exposed to additional images. We know what happened. But to non-Israelis, it is very important to show the images because this is not like other things that were seen, especially as part of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as for privacy issues, it's very important to remember that these images were posted on social networks on October 7th already. And it is also important that not to silence the fact that it happened. It's not the victims' shame. It's not their fault. They are not the ones who should be ashamed. It's the perpetrators who should be ashamed, who should be held responsible for what they did. And in order for this to be done, we have to show these images, and also as a way of telling the victims and the victims who survived that it's not their fault, that there's nothing really to be ashamed of.
Now, let me ask you another question. As a historian, we know now that the Hamas terrorists on October 7th were induced by drugs that, among other things, enhance sexual drive. Is there any precedent to that in history? I know that I read somewhere that the Nazis used drugs as well to enhance the physical performance of the soldiers. Is there something that we know from history?
So I'm a historian of the earlier periods in which this was definitely not documented, so I'm not the person to answer this kind of question, but we should bear in mind that rape, especially rape of this kind, that is systematic and that is part of a strategy as a weapon of war, is not a question of sexual drive. Again, this is where we distinguish between opportunistic rape, which may be just one soldier having a sexual drive and wanting to gratify himself, making use of the situation. But what we have here is really a matter of violence, of inflicting
Was part
violence.
of a plan.
It's part of a plan of inflicting violence as a way of inflicting psychological terror and humiliating the other side. And also, I mean, if we think of the way these things were done, mutilating the vagina, the breasts of Israeli girls and women, as a way of, and then filming it as a way of of saying, we are really harming the reproductive capacity of the enemy. I mean, this has a symbolic, very symbolic message. It's not about sexual drive.
Yeah, and by the way, there is
Or not only about, I mean, the sexual drive may be induced in order to perform these things, but when we talk about rape during war, also the mutilation, the things that we heard about are very much a part of it.
Yeah. No, what I read was that the purpose of the drugs was obviously to enhance the plan, but those drugs were used in history for other things too. I just wanted to tell our viewers and our listeners, that those who are interested in the subject matter, that there's a very powerful opinion video made by, and I don't know, Professor Herzig, if you had a chance to see that, by a Jewish journalist from the United States by the name of Barry Weiss, who spent about 30 minutes describing the failure of feminist organizations and organizations that are out there to protect women, to address appropriately what happened on October 7th. And I just wanted to thank you for spending this time with us, and give you our gratitude for educating us and enriching us, and pushing forward the message of our victims out there. Thank you so much.
May I add just one more thing?
Sure, of course.
I think this issue, we should keep reminding whoever we're talking to about this, also because we still have hostages, including female hostages, and we can only imagine what they're going through. And this is what makes the silence of international organizations even more outrageous.
And I know that there are some entities out there, especially in North America, planning to sue these organizations for failing to uphold their own mission statements and their own standards.
Yes.
And I think that this is an important work. Well, Professor Herzig, thank you so much for being with us. I hope to be able to host you again in the near future, hopefully with better news about the hostages and with better news about the response of international organizations.
Thank you.
And to our viewers and listeners back home, greetings from Tel Aviv until our next episode. Bye-bye.
This is Tao Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.